In a small town, an orphan boy discovers a passion for music that leads him from street performances to Carnegie Hall. But even as he achieves his dreams, he is haunted by questions about his past. A journey into his roots reveals a hidden legacy that could change everything. The sun had barely risen over the sleepy town, casting long shadows on the cobblestone streets as it peeked through the narrow windows of St. Mary's Home for Children. Inside, a boy of about 10 years, with tousled hair and bright, searching eyes, was already awake. The orphanage, a crumbling building that seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten dreams, had been his home for as long as he could remember. Yet, even within its worn walls, a small spark of life flickered inside him, a spark that revealed itself whenever he heard the soft strains of music floating through the thin walls. From the first moment Daniel heard the distant melody of a violin drifting through the orphanage's creaking hallways, he knew he had found something precious. It wasn't just sound, it was a feeling, a pull, a magnetic force that made his heart beat faster and his breath catch. He had never seen a violin up close, much less touched one, but he could picture it perfectly in his mind: sleek, polished wood, strings taut and ready to sing. The other children at the orphanage would race through their days, playing games or getting into mischief, but Daniel would find a quiet corner, close his eyes, and imagine the bow gliding across the strings, producing sounds that seemed almost magical. The caretaker, Mrs. Harrison, was a stern woman, her face etched with the weariness of a life spent caring for other people's children. Yet, there was a softness in her eyes when she saw Daniel's interest in music. She had caught him more than once, his small frame pressed against the walls, straining to hear the music from the street below. "You're a curious one, aren't you?" she'd say, ruffling his hair with a sigh. She knew that life at the orphanage was no place for nurturing such dreams, but Daniel's passion was undeniable. One gray afternoon, when the rain pattered softly against the windows, Daniel stumbled upon an old violin case in the attic. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, forgotten like so many things in the orphanage. His heart pounded as he unlatched the case, revealing a slightly worn violin inside. The strings were dull, and the bow was missing a few hairs, but to Daniel, it was a treasure beyond measure. He carefully lifted the instrument, holding it awkwardly under his chin, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged was scratchy and uneven, but to him it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Word of Daniel's newfound obsession soon spread through the orphanage. Some of the other boys mocked him, while others looked on with curiosity. But Daniel didn't care. Every free moment he had was spent with that violin, practicing in secret corners, trying to coax the melodies he heard in his mind out of the stubborn strings. Mrs. Harrison, noticing his dedication, quietly arranged for him to attend free music lessons at the local community center, a place where old instruments and passionate teachers were the only luxuries. At the community center, Daniel was a fish out of water among the other children, many of whom came from more privileged backgrounds. They arrived with their shiny, new instruments and practiced under the watchful eyes of doting parents. But Daniel had something they didn't: an insatiable hunger. His first teacher, Mr. Thompson, was a retired musician who had seen many students pass through his doors. He was struck by Daniel's raw talent and determination. The boy's hands were too small, his fingers not yet used to the delicate dance across the strings, but his spirit was undeniable. Daniel would practice until his fingers were blistered, the strings biting into his skin, but he never complained. There was something inside him that needed to be expressed, something that only the violin could release. Mr. Thompson watched with a mixture of awe and concern as Daniel poured himself into the music. The boy's passion was a double-edged sword. While it drove him to excel, it also left him vulnerable, with little to fall back on if the dream crumbled. Resources were limited. The violin strings would snap under the strain of constant practice, and replacing them was a luxury Daniel couldn't afford. He would scavenge for anything that could be used to repair his violin, sometimes tying the strings back together or patching up the body with whatever he could find. The instrument was battered and bruised, much like its owner, but it still produced music that made people stop and listen. As Daniel's skills grew, so did his reputation. The community center became his second home, a place where he was no longer just an orphan, but a young musician with a gift that couldn't be ignored. The staff at the center would often find him there long after the other children had gone home, practicing in the empty halls, the music echoing through the building as if it were searching for something. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Daniel made a decision that would change his life. He would take his music to the streets. Performing on the streets was not something a 10-year-old boy should do, especially one without a family to watch over him. But Daniel was determined. He wanted to share his music with the world, to see if the melodies he played could touch others the way they touched him. He began sneaking out of the orphanage, violin in hand, and finding a spot on the corner of Main Street, where the passers-by were numerous and the nights were cool. At first, people ignored him, brushing past without a glance. But as Daniel played, pouring all his emotion into each note, heads began to turn. The rough, scratchy sound of his violin softened, growing more confident with each performance. The townfolk started to recognize him, the small boy with the big talent. They would stop, listen, and sometimes drop a few coins into the case at his feet. Daniel didn't care much for the money, he cared that they listened, that they heard him. Before long, he had a small following, shopkeepers who would pause in their work to listen, mothers with their children, even the old men who sat on the benches, smoking pipes and reminiscing about days gone by. Daniel's music was becoming part of the town's fabric, a melody that wove itself into the lives of those who stopped to listen. He wasn't just an orphan anymore. He was the boy who played the violin, the boy whose music made you feel something deep inside, something you couldn't quite name. The winter air was crisp and biting, yet Daniel stood on his usual street corner, the collar of his worn jacket pulled up against the cold. The violin, his constant companion, rested comfortably under his chin, and he began to play. His fingers, though numb from the cold, moved with a grace that seemed almost impossible for a boy his age. The music that poured from his violin was a mixture of longing and hope, a melody that captured the attention of those hurrying by, making them pause, even if only for a moment. That particular day, as the late afternoon shadows stretched long and thin across the streets, a man stopped a few paces away from Daniel. He was bundled in a thick coat, his gray hair tucked under a woolen cap, but there was something about him that set him apart from the usual passers-by. He didn't simply listen, he absorbed the music, letting it wash over him like a wave. His eyes never left Daniel, studying the boy with an intensity that would have unnerved anyone else, but Daniel was lost in his own world, oblivious to the stranger's scrutiny. It wasn't until the final note hung in the air, trembling with the remnants of the emotion Daniel had poured into it, that the man stepped forward. Daniel glanced up, startled, and quickly lowered his violin, half expecting to be shooed away as had happened so many times before. "You play beautifully," the man said, his voice deep and warm, carrying a slight accent that Daniel couldn't quite place. There was something in the way he spoke, an authority tempered by genuine admiration, that made Daniel straighten his posture. "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied, his voice soft but steady. He had been complimented before, but never like this. There was something about the man that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't experienced before. The man smiled, a gesture that softened the lines of his face. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, though there was no hint of arrogance in the question. Daniel shook his head. The man looked familiar, but he couldn't place him. The violinist simply seemed like someone from another world, one far removed from Daniel's small town and street corner performances. "My name is Itzhak Perlman," the man said, watching for a reaction. Daniel's eyes widened in shock, the name instantly recognizable. Perlman was a legend, a musician whose skill with the violin was unmatched, and whose story was known to anyone who had ever touched a bow. Daniel had heard of him, of course, but never in his wildest dreams did he imagine that the great Itzhak Perlman would be standing in front of him, listening to him play. "You," Daniel started, his voice faltering. "You're him." It was all he could manage, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Perlman chuckled softly, nodding. "Yes, I suppose I am. And I have to say, young man, you have an extraordinary gift. Your playing, it's raw, but it's something special." Daniel's heart raced, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He had always played because he loved it, because it felt like a part of him. But to hear these words from someone like Perlman, it felt surreal. "I'd like to hear more," Perlman continued, his tone serious now. "And not just on a street corner. I want to work with you, help you develop that talent of yours." Daniel blinked, the words not quite sinking in. Perlman wanted to help him? This man, who had no reason to care about an orphan playing a beat-up violin on a cold street, was offering to mentor him? It seemed impossible, but the sincerity in Perlman's eyes told Daniel that it was real. I don't know what to say," Daniel stammered, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his violin. "Thank you, Mr. Perlman. I don't have. I can't." "Don't worry about anything," Perlman said, cutting him off gently. "I'll take care of the details. All you need to do is play. Can you do that for me?" Daniel nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He could hardly believe this was happening, but the look in Perlman's eyes was reassuring, grounding him in this incredible reality. Over the next few weeks, Perlman visited Daniel regularly, sometimes at the community center, sometimes on the very street corner where they had first met. With each session, Daniel felt his playing transform, the rough edges smoothing out under Perlman's guidance. The way Perlman spoke to him, firm but encouraging, instilled a confidence in Daniel that he had never known before. It was as if Perlman saw something in him that no one else had, not even Daniel himself. One chilly evening, after an especially intense session at the community center, Perlman sat Daniel down, his expression serious, but kind. "Daniel," he began, "you've grown tremendously in such a short time. Your dedication and passion are remarkable. But I think it's time we consider the next step." "The next step?" Daniel echoed, uncertain of what Perlman meant. "Yes," Perlman replied. "You have an incredible talent, but to truly nurture it, you need more than what I can offer here. I've been in contact with the Juilliard School of Music in New York. They're willing to give you a full scholarship to study there." Daniel stared at him, his heart pounding. Juilliard was the stuff of dreams, a place where only the best of the best were accepted. And now Perlman was telling him that he could go there? It was overwhelming, too much to process all at once. "I don't know how to thank you," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The thought of leaving everything he knew, even the orphanage, was terrifying, but the opportunity was too incredible to pass up. Perlman reached out, placing a comforting hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, Daniel. Just keep playing, keep pushing yourself. The world deserves to hear your music. And Juilliard will help you find your voice." Daniel stood in the grand hallway of Itzhak Perlman's home, his violin case clutched tightly in his hands. The house was elegant, filled with warm colors and rich woodwork, the kind of place he had only seen in movies. It felt strange to be here, a world away from the drafty orphanage where he had spent most of his life. He tried to steady his breath, but everything about this place, the high ceilings, the expensive furniture, the faint scent of polished wood, made him feel like an imposter. "Daniel, welcome," came a voice from behind him. He turned to see Perlman standing there, a gentle smile on his face, his wife Toby beside him. She was a petite woman with a kind expression, her eyes filled with the warmth of someone who had longed for this moment. They approached him together, their presence so natural in this space, while he felt as though he were intruding. "This is your home now," Toby said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We're so glad you're here." Daniel nodded, his throat tightening. He wanted to say something, to express the whirlwind of emotions inside him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he managed a small smile, hoping it conveyed even a fraction of what he was feeling. The days that followed were a blur of new experiences. The Perlman household was filled with music, not just from Itzhak's violin but from every corner of the house. The piano in the living room was never quiet for long, and the air seemed to hum with the energy of creativity. Daniel, however, found it difficult to adjust. He had spent so many years in the orphanage, a place defined by scarcity and routine, that this new life felt almost too good to be true. Toby, sensing his discomfort, did her best to make him feel at home. She would sit with him during meals, asking about his day, his practice sessions, and what he thought of Juilliard. She spoke with a calm, soothing voice, but Daniel often found himself at a loss for words. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the Perlman's kindness, while genuine, sometimes felt overwhelming. Juilliard, too, was a world apart from anything he had known. The school was intimidating, filled with students who had been playing since they could walk, their technique flawless, their confidence unshakable. Daniel would walk through the hallways, his violin case slung over his shoulder, and feel the weight of every gaze, every note played around him. He practiced harder than ever, often late into the night, his fingers raw and aching, driven by a fear of not measuring up. But no matter how much he improved, there was always a voice in the back of his mind whispering that he didn't belong. Perlman was a patient mentor, guiding him with a steady hand, never pushing too hard, always encouraging. "It's not about perfection, Daniel," he would say during their sessions. "It's about finding your voice, your own sound. Don't let the pressure drown that out." But Daniel found it difficult to believe him. The stakes felt impossibly high, and he knew that Perlman had taken a chance on him, a chance that came with expectations. At home, Toby would often find him in his room, violin in hand, his face drawn in concentration. She would sit beside him, not saying much, just listening, her presence a quiet comfort. "You're allowed to make mistakes," she would remind him gently. "You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders." But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he owed them something more than just hard work. He owed them success, perfection, a proof that their faith in him wasn't misplaced. The strain began to take its toll. His sleep became restless, filled with dreams of failing in front of an audience, of Perlman and Toby watching him with disappointment in their eyes. He would wake up in a cold sweat, the sheets tangled around him, the pressure sitting heavy on his chest. The gratitude he felt for the Perlman's kindness was genuine, but it was tangled with a growing anxiety that he couldn't seem to shake. The first time he played at a Juilliard recital, the audience filled with students, faculty, and a few invited guests, Daniel felt the full weight of his new reality. As he stood backstage, waiting for his turn, he could hear the other performers, each one flawless, each one reminding him of just how high the bar had been set. When his name was called, his heart raced so fast he thought it might burst. He walked onto the stage, the lights blinding, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his violin to his chin. The first few notes were shaky, his bow slipping awkwardly across the strings, and he heard a faint rustle from the audience. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to keep playing, his mind racing. Perlman's words echoed in his head, urging him to find his own sound, but all he could hear was the critical voice that told him he was failing. When he finished, the applause was polite, but subdued. Daniel knew he had not played his best, and the weight of that knowledge sat heavy on him as he left the stage. Back home, Toby waited for him, a comforting presence as always. She didn't ask how it went, she didn't need to. One look at his face told her everything. Instead, she pulled him into a gentle hug, whispering, "You're doing just fine, Daniel. One step at a time." But even as he nodded, even as he told himself that mistakes were part of the process, Daniel couldn't help but feel the pressure building. Every kind word, every gesture of support from the Perlmans, felt like a reminder of how much was riding on him. He loved them for taking him in, for giving him a home, but that love was mingled with a fear he couldn't ignore, the fear that he would let them down. As the weeks passed, Daniel found himself caught between two worlds. At Juilliard, he was surrounded by the best, the brightest, each day a reminder of the extraordinary talent he was up against. At home, he was enveloped in the warmth of a family who wanted nothing more than for him to be happy. But he was not a child anymore, and the dreams he had nurtured on the cold streets of his hometown had grown into something more complicated, more demanding. The music that had once been his escape now felt like a double-edged sword, a source of both joy and relentless pressure. He wanted to make the Perlmans proud, to prove that they had made the right choice in adopting him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of their expectations was too much to bear. The more he played, the more he felt the strain, his love for music becoming entangled with the fear of failure. In the quiet moments, when he was alone in his room, Daniel would pick up his violin and play not for Juilliard, not for Perlman, not for anyone else, but for himself. It was in these moments, when the pressure lifted, that he could still feel the pure, untainted joy that had driven him to play in the first place. But these moments were becoming rare, fleeting glimpses of a time when music was simply music, not a measure of his worth. The Perlmans continued to support him, unaware of the internal conflict that raged within him. They saw the hardworking, talented young man they had taken into their home, the boy with the gift that had captured their hearts. But Daniel saw something different in the mirror, a young musician struggling to balance gratitude with the crushing weight of expectation. And so, Daniel found himself at a crossroads. He was no longer the orphan playing on the streets, nor was he fully at ease in the world of elite music education. The pressure to live up to his potential, to meet the expectations of those who had given him everything, was pushing him to his limits. He knew he had to find a way to reconcile the two, to rediscover the love of music that had brought him this far. But how, and at what cost, he could not yet see. The lights of Carnegie Hall were bright, the stage polished to a gleam underfoot. Daniel stood at its center, the familiar weight of his violin resting in his hands. The audience, an assembly of the city's elite, sat in hushed anticipation, waiting for him to begin. He had dreamed of this moment for as long as he could remember, and now, here he was, about to play on one of the most prestigious stages in the world. The applause had already erupted once, when he took the stage, a wave of sound that should have filled him with pride. But as he lifted his bow and drew the first note, a hollow feeling settled in his chest, as if the applause had somehow echoed through an empty space inside him. The music flowed effortlessly from his fingers, each note precise, every phrase meticulously crafted. He played with a skill honed through years of relentless practice, his technique flawless, his execution near perfect. But as the piece progressed, Daniel felt disconnected, as though he were watching himself from a distance. The passion that had once driven him seemed dulled, replaced by a mechanical precision that left little room for the joy he once knew. The audience responded as expected, their applause thunderous and prolonged, but to Daniel, it felt as though he were listening from behind a wall of glass, unable to feel the warmth of their admiration. When the concert ended, he was swept into a whirlwind of handshakes, congratulations, and glowing praise. Perlman, standing proudly beside him, introduced him to patrons and critics alike, each one lavishing him with compliments. Toby was there too, her eyes shining with pride, her smile radiant. They were all so happy, so proud of what he had accomplished. But Daniel could only manage a tight smile, his heart heavy with a sense of loss he couldn't quite explain. Later that night, as the city hummed quietly outside his window, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, the silence pressing in on him. The violin rested on the table beside him, its presence both comforting and accusing. He had achieved what many only dreamed of. Playing at Carnegie Hall was the pinnacle of success for a musician, a recognition of talent and dedication. Yet, as he stared out into the darkness, Daniel felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Instead, there was an emptiness, a gnawing sense that something was missing, something essential that had slipped through his fingers without him noticing. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself that it was just the letdown after such a monumental performance, that he would feel better in the morning. But the unease lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. The world saw him as a success, a young man who had risen from nothing to become a star, but Daniel felt like he was standing on a precipice, looking down into an abyss that threatened to swallow him whole. The applause, the accolades, they all felt hollow, as though they belonged to someone else, some version of himself that he no longer recognized. Weeks passed, and the emptiness only deepened. He continued to practice, to perform, to go through the motions of his life, but there was a distance now, a disconnection that he couldn't seem to bridge. The music, once a source of joy and solace, had become a burden, a constant reminder of the expectations he had met but found no comfort in. He began to question everything, his choices, his motivations, the very foundation of his identity as a musician. What was the point of all the success if it left him feeling like this? The turning point came one quiet afternoon when he stumbled across an old photograph tucked away in a drawer. It was a picture of him as a child, standing on the street corner with his battered violin, a small, defiant smile on his face. The memory hit him with the force of a blow, the cold winter air, the worn cobblestones under his feet, the way the music had filled him with a sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than himself. Back then, the violin had been more than just an instrument, it had been his voice, his way of telling the world that he existed, that he mattered. As he stared at the photo, something inside him shifted. He realized that in his quest for success, for validation, he had lost sight of what had drawn him to music in the first place. He had become so focused on achieving his dreams, on proving himself, that he had forgotten the simple joy of playing, of letting the music speak for itself. And in that forgetting, he had lost a part of himself. That night, as he lay awake, the idea began to take root in his mind. He needed to find out where he came from, to uncover the past that had been hidden from him for so long. The orphanage had given him a roof over his head, but it had never given him answers. He knew nothing of his biological parents, nothing of the life they had lived before fate brought him to St. Mary's Home for Children. Perhaps, he thought, if he could find out more about them, if he could understand where he came from, he might be able to make sense of the emptiness that had settled in his soul. The decision was made in the quiet hours of the morning, as the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky. He would hire a private investigator, someone who could dig into the past, uncover the secrets that had been buried for so long. It wasn't just about finding his biological family, it was about finding himself, about reclaiming the part of him that had been lost in the pursuit of a dream that now felt more like a cage. Daniel sat in the dim light of his apartment, the faint glow of the city outside casting long shadows across the room. The phone call had been brief, to the point, just enough time to explain his request and arrange the details. The man on the other end had sounded professional, efficient, with the kind of calm confidence Daniel needed. Hiring a private investigator was a step he'd never imagined taking, but here he was, compelled by a need he couldn't fully articulate. A few days later, the investigator, Jack Hayes, met him at a small cafe downtown. Jack was middle-aged, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, his demeanor no-nonsense yet approachable. He had spent years unraveling the tangled histories of those who sought his help, and Daniel's case, though delicate, didn't intimidate him. As they sipped coffee, Daniel explained his background, the orphanage, the vague memories that haunted him, and his desperate need to know where he came from. Jack listened intently, asking the occasional question, but mostly letting Daniel talk. When he finished, Jack leaned back in his chair, considering. "We'll start with the basics," he said. "Birth records, any existing adoption papers, details from the orphanage. It might take some time, but I've got a good feeling about this. There's always something, some thread we can pull on to unravel the story." The days turned into weeks as Daniel waited, his mind a whirl of anxiety and anticipation. He threw himself into his music, but even the violin couldn't drown out the questions that kept surfacing. He wondered what kind of people his parents had been, what had led them to leave him at the orphanage, and why there had been no trace of them afterward. The unknowns gnawed at him, making it difficult to focus on anything else. Then, one evening, Jack called. "I've got something," he said, his voice steady, yet carrying an undercurrent of excitement. "Meet me at my office tomorrow. We need to go over it in person." Daniel barely slept that night, his thoughts racing ahead of him. When he arrived at Jack's office the next morning, he felt a mixture of dread and hope. Jack was already seated behind his desk, a folder in front of him. As Daniel sat down, Jack slid the folder across the desk. "We found your birth records," Jack began, his tone measured. "You were born in a small town in the Appalachian Mountains, Greenwood Hollow, population about 200. Your birth certificate lists your parents as Sarah and Matthew Lawson." Daniel stared at the paper, the names unfamiliar yet powerful in their simplicity. His hands trembled slightly as he ran his fingers over the faded ink, the connection to his past suddenly more real than it had ever been. "There's more," Jack continued, leaning forward. "Your parents were both musicians, part of a local folk tradition that's been passed down through generations. Greenwood Hollow is known for its music. It's a small town, but the people there have a deep connection to their roots. Your parents were well known in the community, played at festivals, local gatherings. They were young, talented, had a lot of potential." Daniel felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. His parents had been musicians, just like him. The thought was both comforting and painful, a connection to them that he had never expected, yet it deepened the loss he had always felt. Jack paused, giving Daniel a moment to absorb the information. "After your birth, your parents disappeared from Greenwood Hollow. No one knows exactly what happened, but there are rumors. Some say they left to pursue their music career in a bigger city, others think something might have happened to them, something the townsfolks don't like to talk about. It's a small place, secrets are kept close." Daniel sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him. He had come looking for answers, and now he had them, but they only led to more questions. What had happened to his parents? Why had they left Greenwood Hollow, and how had he ended up at an orphanage miles away? The threads were beginning to form a pattern, but the picture was still unclear. Daniel felt an overwhelming urge to see the place where his story began. It was as if he needed to walk the same streets, breathe the same air, to understand who he truly was. The connection to the local folk music tradition, something deeply woven into his parents' lives, was now something he desperately wanted to explore. He imagined the melodies that must have filled the air in Greenwood Hollow, the music that was part of his heritage, and he felt a pull stronger than anything he had ever experienced. Daniel arrived in Greenwood Hollow under the cover of a misty dawn, the early morning fog clinging to the mountains like a shroud. He had chosen to come quietly, without revealing his true purpose to anyone in town. He wanted to blend in, to observe and listen, knowing that a small community like this might be wary of outsiders, especially one asking about the past. Renting a modest room at the town's only inn, he introduced himself as a traveling musician, eager to learn more about the local folk traditions. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Over the next few days, Daniel explored Greenwood Hollow, soaking in the sights and sounds of the town that had once been home to his parents. The town was small, with a single main street lined with weathered buildings and a few scattered houses that seemed to grow out of the mountains themselves. Life here moved at a different pace, unhurried and grounded in traditions that had been passed down for generations. Everywhere Daniel went, he heard music, on porches, in backyards, at the local cafe. The melodies were simple yet rich, carrying the weight of history in every note. It was a music that felt oddly familiar, as though it had been lying dormant within him all along, waiting to be awakened. As he wandered, Daniel kept his violin close, playing quietly to himself when the mood struck. The music he played was a blend of the classical training he had received and the folk tunes he had absorbed since arriving in Greenwood Hollow. The result was something that felt deeply personal, a bridge between the world he had known and the one he was just beginning to understand. One afternoon, Daniel found a secluded spot on the edge of town, a small clearing surrounded by trees. The place was quiet, with only the sounds of birds and the rustling leaves to keep him company. He took out his violin and began to play, letting the music flow freely, the notes weaving together in a way that felt natural, instinctual. He closed his eyes, lost in the sound, feeling as though the music was guiding him rather than the other way around. When he finished, Daniel opened his eyes to find an elderly man standing a few feet away, watching him with a thoughtful expression. The man was tall and lean, with a weathered face and a fiddle tucked under one arm. His eyes, though old, were sharp, and they held a spark of recognition as they met Daniel's. "You've got a good sound," the man said, his voice rough, but kind. "There's something in your playing that reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago." Daniel felt a jolt of anticipation. "My name's Daniel," he said, lowering his violin. "I'm here to learn about the music, and about my parents, Sarah and Matthew Lawson. They were from here." The man's eyes widened slightly, and he stepped closer. "I'm Hank," he replied, extending a hand. "I knew your parents well. Played alongside them more times than I can count. They were something special, those two. The way they played together, it was like they were speaking a language only they understood." Daniel's heart pounded as Hank spoke, the connection to his parents suddenly more real, more immediate. "What were they like?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with both eagerness and trepidation. Hank smiled faintly, a mix of fondness and sorrow in his eyes. "They were the heart of this town, especially when it came to music. Your father, Matthew, had a way with the fiddle that could make a person laugh or cry, sometimes both at once. And your mother, Sarah, she sang like an angel. But it wasn't just their talent, it was the way they lived the music, the way it was a part of everything they did. They weren't just musicians, they were storytellers, healers in their own way, bringing people together with every note." Daniel listened intently, each word from Hank painting a picture of the parents he had never known. It was bittersweet, hearing about their lives, their passion, and knowing that he had inherited something so vital from them. But it also deepened the ache of their loss, the void that had always been there, just beneath the surface. "Why did they leave?" Daniel asked, his voice almost a whisper. "What happened to them?" Hank's expression grew somber, his gaze distant as he looked back through the years. "There was an accident," he said quietly, the weight of the memory evident in his tone. "It was during the spring festival, the biggest event of the year in Greenwood Hollow. Your parents were the highlight, as they always were, playing to a crowd that loved them. But the stage they were on, it was old, hadn't been repaired in years. It collapsed during their performance." Daniel's breath caught, his worst fears surfacing. Were they? He couldn't bring himself to finish the question. They didn't survive, Hank confirmed, his voice heavy with sorrow. But they died saving you. They got you out of harm's way before the stage came down. They didn't have enough time to save themselves. Daniel sat in stunned silence, the truth hitting him like a physical blow. His parents had sacrificed themselves for him, their love for their child stronger than their instinct for self-preservation. The realization was overwhelming, a mixture of deep grief and profound gratitude. Why didn't anyone tell me? Daniel asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Hank sighed, shaking his head slowly. After the accident, the town changed. People didn't want to talk about it, it was too painful, too much guilt and sorrow. The festival organizers were blamed for not maintaining the stage, and the town just shut down around the memory. When you were taken to the orphanage, it was easier for everyone to let the past stay buried. But those of us who knew your parents, we never forgot. Daniel looked down at his violin, the instrument that had connected him to his parents, without him even knowing it. The music that had been his lifeline, his identity, was also his inheritance, a gift from two people who had loved him more than he could ever have imagined. Hank placed a comforting hand on Daniel's shoulder. Your parents were remarkable people, Daniel. They left a legacy in this town, in the music. And now, that legacy lives on in you. You've got their gift, and you've got their spirit. That's something worth carrying forward. The discovery of his parents' fate weighed heavily on Daniel's heart, but it also brought him a strange sense of relief. He had come to Greenwood Hollow seeking the truth, and though the answers he found were painful, they were also illuminating. His parents had been extraordinary musicians, deeply rooted in the traditions of their small Appalachian town, and they had given their lives to save him. That knowledge filled him with both sorrow and pride, a complex mix of emotions that he carried back with him to New York. Returning to the city, Daniel felt different. The bustling streets and towering buildings that had once felt so familiar now seemed almost alien. He had spent his entire life in pursuit of a dream shaped by the demands of a world that valued perfection and prestige above all else. But Greenwood Hollow had shown him another way, one that valued connection, community, and the raw, unfiltered expression of emotion through music. As he resumed his routine, practicing and performing, Daniel began to experiment with his playing. He started blending the classical techniques he had mastered with the folk melodies he had heard in Greenwood Hollow. At first, the integration felt awkward, as if the two styles were speaking different languages. But as he persisted, something began to change. The music evolved, becoming richer, more layered, with a depth that surprised even him. The old folk tunes carried a soulfulness that the precision of classical music often lacked, and when combined, they created something new, something uniquely his own. Daniel found himself drawn to his violin in a way he hadn't felt in years. The instrument, once a tool of discipline and ambition, now became a vessel for his personal exploration. He played not just to impress others or to achieve a level of technical excellence, but to express the emotions that had been building inside him, grief, love, and a deep connection to his roots. The music flowed from him in a way that was both cathartic and healing, each note a step closer to understanding himself and his place in the world. His performances began to change as well. Audiences who had come to expect flawless renditions of classical masterpieces were now hearing something different, something more personal, more alive. Daniel noticed the shift in their reactions. The polite applause that typically followed his performances was replaced by a deeper, more resonant silence, followed by applause that felt genuine, filled with emotion. It was as if they were hearing him for the first time, truly hearing him, and it felt like a homecoming. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, Daniel sat in his dressing room, the applause still echoing in his ears. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction that came not from the accolades, but from the music itself. He thought of his parents, of the life they had lived and the legacy they had passed on to him. Their music, born from the mountains and the traditions of their people, was now part of his music, woven into the fabric of his identity. It was then that Daniel made a decision. He would no longer play solely for the approval of others, or to meet the expectations of a world that had, for so long, defined his worth. Instead, he would play for himself, for his parents, and for the music that had connected them all. He would honor their memory not by trying to be someone else, but by embracing who he truly was, a musician who straddled two worlds, who carried both the precision of classical training and the soul of folk tradition. In the months that followed, Daniel's music career took on a new direction. He began incorporating more folk elements into his compositions and performances, blending them with classical pieces in a way that felt organic and true to his roots. He sought out collaborations with folk musicians, inviting them to share the stage with him, creating a dialogue between genres that was both innovative and deeply respectful of tradition. The result was a sound that was uniquely his own, a reflection of the journey he had taken to find himself. Critics and audiences alike were captivated by the transformation. Daniel's performances were praised not just for their technical brilliance, but for their emotional depth and authenticity. He was no longer just a prodigy or a virtuoso, he was an artist with a voice that resonated with the experiences of both his past and present. He was, at last, at peace with the path he had chosen. One evening, after a particularly well-received concert, Daniel found himself alone on the stage of Carnegie Hall, the very place where he had once felt so lost. The auditorium was empty now, the seats vacated, the lights dimmed, but the sense of fulfillment that filled him was undeniable. He lifted his violin and began to play, not for anyone else, but for himself, for the boy who had once played on street corners, for the young man who had chased a dream, and for the son who had finally found his way home. The notes echoed through the empty hall, a blend of classical and folk, of past and present. The music was his final movement, a culmination of everything he had learned, everything he had become. And as the last note faded into the silence, Daniel felt a deep, abiding peace, knowing that he had finally found his true voice.